Double checking. Okay, so how's everyone doing? We're doing good? Okay, so we're now live. So today I was going to talk about we're going to go back into Pirkei Avot again today. So I wanted to introduce you to a guy by the name of Hanina ben Tradion. Hanina ben Tradion is a fascinating fellow because of his own life, but not only just because of his own life, but also because of his daughter's life. His daughter ends up becoming the most famous woman in the Talmud. So if you could think back and think, who would you think would be the most famous woman in Jewish history, you would probably think of Miriam or Sarah, maybe Rivka, Rachel, Leah. But actually, in Talmudic times, there's one woman that is spoken about from the Mishnaic era more than any other woman from that time, and her name is Bruria. So I thought I would dedicate just a few minutes. Maybe one day I'll give an entire discussion just on her, because she is truly a brilliant and fascinating woman, and there's plenty of stories within the Talmud from her. But before I get to Bruria, I wanted to talk to you about Hanina ben Tradion. Hanina ben Tradion is a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva. Now, we spoke last week a bit about the 10 martyrs. He is one of the 10 martyrs that we read about on Yom Kippur. And it's quite fascinating the way we see his life go on. He's considered this tremendous scholar, and he's known to be the most trustworthy person. So much so. Hi, Fritz.
Hello.
He's considered such a trustworthy person, Hanina ben Tradion, that the Talmud makes like an incredulous statement saying, if anybody wants to give charity and gives it to anybody that is not as trustworthy as Hanina ben Tradion, then don't give it. But what the Talmud is trying to say is not saying, don't check that everyone is the most trustworthy person. That's close to impossible. But what I do understand the Talmud to be saying is that Hanina ben Tradion was considered the most trusted person in his time. There was just such great honesty in who he was. And he was a legendary charity collector. He helped many people with his charity work. And he felt that in his times, the Romans had outlawed Torah study. And he felt that it was his job to continue Torah study, as did many other great rabbis in his times, like Rabbi Akiva. Hey, David. So Hanina ben Tradion, after he was one of the great teachers, so after the Romans saying no more Torah study, he sets up undercover Torah schools. It wasn't just Chabad in Russia doing this, but this started back in the Roman days, and it's happened throughout history, when we have the great people at the time setting up undercover schools when they make Torah study illegal in public. And he did this for a certain amount of time until he was caught. And when he was caught, he was considered one of the great 10 martyrs of the time. He was put to death, and he was wrapped, before he was killed, he was wrapped in a Torah scroll.
Thank you.
And when he was wrapped in this Torah scroll, his daughter, who I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, Bruria, saw her father painfully being burnt, the slow, painful death with wet, with moist Torah. And she couldn't bear to see it. She was considered people considered her to be the great student of her father, as we're going to see. and she was crying bitterly. And she says, "What?" She said she cried and says, "Woe is to me that I get to see my father in such a state, my father and teacher." And then, as she's saying that, he replies, "No, my daughter, have no fear, because the very fact that they wrapped me in the Torah, now I know. If it was just me, out of humility," he says, "if it was just me, I don't know if my death would ever be revenged. But now that they have wrapped me in the Torah, I know that the Torah will be revenged. And therefore, I know that my death will be revenged, and goodness and justice will come back." And the later generations, the law was abolished, and Jews were allowed to study Torah again in public. So that's the story of Rabbi Hanina ben Trajan, just a few concepts. But I'll tell you a bit about Beruria. Not all the stories. There's lots of stories in the Talmud about Beruria. As I mentioned, she was the most written about woman in the Talmudic times. This is the daughter of Hanina ben Trajan. And she marries the great Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir is considered one of the greatest. Rabbi Meir is a generation after Rabbi Akiva. He's considered one of the greatest rabbis in all of history. As a matter of fact, they say that anytime you have a statement in the Mishna and there's no name to it, it's almost always Rabbi Meir. And there's thousands of statements in the Mishnah. Almost every Mishnah would have a statement from somebody that doesn't have a name to it. The first one is known as a Tanakama, is often without a name. And then we understand that when there's no name, it's almost always Rabbi Meir. So we understand that he is probably the most quoted person in all of the Mishnah. His wife is not just an ordinary woman, she's also a great teacher and scholar. We're told that his wife, Beruria, would actually teach the rabbis, but she wanted to do it in a modest way. She would teach students, the rabbinic students, and she wants to do it in a modest way. So what she would do is she would hide herself behind the curtain, the mechitza, and men would come and listen to her talks. So that they would be listening to her words, but not looking at her. And we know that there are certain rules, that there was debate within the rabbis, and she was able to clarify them. There's one famous line that we have in Torah study, which we famously know that she really highlighted. There's a story that the Talmud tells us about how once she saw somebody studying quietly in his corner, and she said, "Don't you know that it's been taught in the Torah that one that studies in silence forgets quickly? If you want to remember, you have to study loud." And that's why we as Jewish people, the library situation, or the Jewish library situation, doesn't really exist within the Jewish world as much as it does within the secular academic world. When you walk into a Torah library, usually it's a yeshiva, which is covered from floor to ceiling, all four corners in books, thousands of books in the average yeshiva. But the noise is on a very high level too. You would struggle to hear the person sitting right next to you. Why? Because everyone is learning with such enthusiasm and discussion. Now that leads us really well into what we're going to discuss today, because what we're going to discuss today is the Jewish method in how we talk and how we study. Okay, so that's what we're getting into today. As I just mentioned one or two things about Beruria. There's many stories about Beruria, and I will one day dedicate a discussion to her, because she is an absolutely fascinating lady. But I want to also do some of the teachings of Hanina ben Trajan first. So let's look. What we are up to is we're up to the second Mishna of the third chapter. And last week we spoke about what happens when you have a corrupt government. Should you be praying for them, or what we pray for? And that was by another Chanina known as Chanina Skana Kohanim. Today we start from the second part of today's Mishnah, and we have an individual by the name of Chanina ben Trajan, who we've introduced already. And he says as follows: Shnayim sheyoshvim ve'ein b'neihem divrei Torah. If you have two individuals that are sitting together and they don't have words of Torah, harei zeh moshav leitzim. This is considered a session of scorners, he writes over here. But scoffers, scorners, what does this mean? So how do you know it? Rabbis don't just make up lines. They look into the Torah to find out what they think. So he has a pasuk in the Torah from Tehillim, from Psalms, that says this. What does it say? King David writes of Moshav Leitzim Lo Yoshav, that he never sat in a session of scorners. He never sat with scorners. Before I explain this, sorry, my phone is. Before I explain this, I'll go a bit further, so we'll finish this first statement. So, first part, he says that if you're sitting together with another individual and there's no Torah study, then you're considered like a moshav leitzim, like scorners, like scoffers, like jokers, as in it's not a positive statement. But if you have two individuals that are sitting and they do start to talk like Torah in Torah, Shechina Shroye B'neihem, then the Shechina. What's the Shechina? The Shechina. Have you heard the word Shechina? What is the Shechina? We'll talk about it in a moment. He says the Shechina will be usually translated as the divine presence, which is what he translates it over here. The divine presence rests among you. Now, how does he know that? Because it says in the verse, what does it say in the verse? Oz nidbaru yirei Hashem, then spoke those that feared God, ish areyu. The fearers of God spoke to each other. And what does it say after about they were speaking? They were just having a conversation. But you understand that it says over here that they were yirei Hashem, they were fearers of Hashem. So we understand that we're talking about something holy. And therefore, vayakshev Hashem, vayishoma. God listened in, then he heard to their conversation. Two individuals are talking, and God's quote unquote, so to speak, listening. Vayikosev sefer zikaron lefonav, and he wrote this book of remembrance before him, leyirei Hashem, to those that fear Hashem, lechoshei shemai, and to those that pronounce or think about his name. Okay, so there's a lot we can talk about over here. So let's just talk about it. What does it mean, or how can we say that if you say if you have a conversation with another individual, that if you are having a conversation in Torah study, then you consider a so to speak a holy conversation. But if you're not, then it's, what is it trying to teach us? What are we trying to teach us? Is it trying to say, okay, every time you sit down with another fellow before you start business, you should always say something holy. You know, there's some people that have this custom that whenever they sit down for something, they always start with what's called the Dvar Malchut, a message, a Torah thought, which is a great, it's a great idea. But the truth is that some people feel like it's unnatural, or it's not me. I'm not a person that always does that. So how can, if I'm a person that doesn't study Torah on a regular basis, or I'm not, don't feel comfortable always, saying, okay, let's start the conversation, let's say something Torah-based. How would you do such a thing? How can you lift up your game? Now, when I actually called this and I said, how to drastically lift your game, drastically change your conversations. And the answer to that is that you are drastically changing your conversation. You could have the same conversation with another individual, and the one time you have that conversation, we're told that you have the conversation with the individual and God's listening to you, God's present, and you could have exactly the same conversation, but with a slight difference, and then God's not with you, and it's not considered a holy conversation. But it's a drastic difference, and it's a simple change. So the Rambam writes that it doesn't mean that you're going to stop every conversation and start saying, okay, I want to tell you Dvar Torah in this week's portion. We read about how Yitzchak goes and digs wells, and we learn out from here that you have to dig wells, and you don't have to stop every conversation and start pontificating and giving all types of deep esoteric teachings. That's not what necessarily is required in order to have God join you in your presence. He says the very fact that two Jews sit together and they simply say something of meaning to each other. They show a bit of care for the other person, or they show something that is meaningful within their conversation. It's not just a pleasure talk that they're just saying jokes, or it's not just a conversation of hello, how are you type of small talk, but it actually has something of value that comes out of the conversation, even though it's not necessarily directly, but you've managed to benefit the other individual or someone to benefit the other person. Says the Rambam, already that would cause Hashem to dwell amongst you. So it's a small thing. It's when I have my small conversations, I make sure to find something meaningful within the conversation, to highlight something meaningful. And that very small idea is what could lift the game. So, some people like to always, if you go to a Shabbos table, a lot of people like to do a really beautiful thing, and what they do is they like to say a Dvar Torah, a thought of Torah at Shabbos. That's a wonderful thing to do. But some people, and myself included, sometimes the conversation is going well. You're having a good conversation, you're busy talking about how bad Dan Andrews is, or how much you love him, or whatever other thing people talk about. I know what anything else what people can talk about in the world today, nothing else exists. So you don't want to interrupt the conversation, this juicy conversation that you're having. You don't want to say, okay, everybody be quiet. We're now going to hear Dvar Torah on the portion. And everyone's like, okay, twiddling their thumbs. When's this guy going to finish? And nobody hears a word he's saying. Okay, tick that box. Finish. Let's go out of here. So what I often try to do is I often try to find a way within the conversation without interrupting the ongoing of the conversation. Sometimes you can't do this, but without interrupting the conversation, to stick in something about the portion or something else. They start talking about how school's going, and then suddenly you start talking about Jewish education or the importance of Torah, but without it's more natural. It's instead of taking a conversation. So both ways work, and yes, there always has to be, and stopping and having something prepared beforehand and making sure that it's interesting is extremely important. But just as important is to make sure that it's not it doesn't become, so to speak, an annoyance or a burden to the people around you. That's something you're going to start and stop the conversation. In the next 30 minutes, you're going to be going on some random topic. But make it fun, make it interesting. When lockdown was great in a way for us, but we used to make games. So we used to do I Spy Parsha, and we would say who can spy this in the Parsha to my kids. It's a great thing to do with little kids. But what that does is, it seems like it's just you're just playing a game, or you're just finding something to do. But really, what we're saying is those small changes to our conversations end up making it from a mundane, scoffer, joking, negative, not holy, unholy conversation to something holy. Something holy means that there's divinity inside of it. You bring the presence of Hashem over there. That's really powerful. So I look at this teaching and I see something that it seems like something that not all of us can necessarily relate to, but I think it's easier than we think. As long as we have a way to find something meaningful or something holy to add to our conversations. And I think about this particularly on Shabbos when we sit down to proper meals, hopefully Friday night and Shabbat day, if you do that as well. But when we're sitting with the family and making sure that we always try to add, doesn't have to, if we're not comfortable to stop the conversation, just adding something of meaning is really important. Okay. Let's go on a bit. And I want to talk to you just before. Sorry, does anybody have any questions or points to add on this point?
Rabbi, I do have one quick question, and it relates to whether that change in conversation to elevate it, whether it needs to become more serious or not, whether that's part of that change in tactic. I know that the lighthearted, the levity, without any other point to it, fair enough. But if the conversation's fairly lighthearted, is it okay, or in the spirit of that Mishna statement, to transform the conversation, still keeping it lighthearted, but changing the target of the topic, maintaining lighthearted?
I think so. I think lighthearted is better if you can, if that's your personality, that you can have a serious conversation without being too serious. It's something that I personally struggle with, but you're quite good at that. But being able to add in jokes and fun, I think that's definitely better, without a doubt. The more fun, the more interactive, the more engaging. Judaism does not, and I think you bring a valid point, Judaism should not, and not only it does not have to be serious and boring and it definitely should not be overly serious and overly scary. Yeah, we've got to take Judaism seriously, but it has to be done joyfully. And that's the real important thing to give over to our kids. If we can find a way to do that we can find joy within Judaism, then we will be able to give it over to our kids. We will be able to get our kids to appreciate it. But I don't know, I was once at a table, a Shabbat table, and I don't know, it was like, I wasn't just once, it's several times in my life that I've been to certain Shabbos Shabbos tables. And it came to a point where, like, at a certain point, the conversation and the talk, okay, now we're going to hear something. And like the father gets into this deep thing and the kids are getting agitated. And I remember once one of my friends, who's another rabbi, he says he was once getting into a conversation. So he once interrupted the thing and says, okay, now I'm going to say a Dvar Torah. And as he starts saying the Dvar Torah, he's just talking, he's saying he learned something and he was getting all into it. And his wife interrupted him and says, you look around, nobody's listening to you. Now, I don't know if that's the most polite thing for a wife to tell their husband or not, but he says that was really powerful. He's like, I was getting all into this thing and I'm seeing all my kids and it just doesn't talk to them. It's not, I haven't engaged them. I've got this beautiful Dvar Torah, great, but what has it done for them? And if it's too serious and if I can't bring it down to their level and make it exciting and interactive, then I think you've missed the point. So I think it's a really, this, if you take this on the forefront, I think most people would take this and say, okay, make sure every time I start, I'm going to say a Dvar Torah, and that's true, you should do that. And that's what it's saying. But on the other hand, if you're going to do that, and then it's going to turn everybody off, and then everyone's going to get annoyed and bored out of their things and not want to come to the Shabbos, what have you gained? What have you accomplished? And therefore, 100%, if you could do it in a lighthearted manner, that you can get people engaged and you could have a meaningful, it doesn't have to be like we're going to stop. They say, what's the worst thing a rabbi can say to start a drasha, a sermon in? The worst line that a rabbi can start his drasha is in this week's parsha. It says, why? It's like a sleeping pill. It immediately puts everyone to sleep. In this week's parsha. No. If you could start with something interesting and then engage people, then good. And that's why Rambam says over here, it's not about saying any deep, great, philosophical, serious, heavy things. It's about trying to find something meaningful in our conversations and noticing that in every moment in life we could bring meaning. And it doesn't have to be and the more you can fit it in, Rabbi Jacobson, I once heard him say, Rabbi Yossi Jacobson, I once heard him say something really powerful. He says, sometimes we feel like we want to teach our kids something. So we're like, oh, my kid's doing this. So I'll kind of stop and I'll say, okay, this is not the way to behave, and this is the thing. Or I come up an idea and I want to talk, and I start preaching to a child. He says that can work, but most likely it won't work as well as you want it to do. However, if you could find some time when your child's already engaged in the conversation, they say, Dad, I've got a question for you. And you could then, when you have those opportunities, use them out, because then your child's listening to you. And that's why I love to encourage questions in shiurim, because as soon as a question, it's not just me coming and teaching something that I've prepared, but now I've seen, hold on, what does it reflect back on you? And how could we relate this back into our lives? Because without questions, then it's difficult to relate back to our lives. And I think that's really important when we're talking about family, and when we are able to bring Judaism and Torah and meaning and live with it with the rest of our lives, and add those things. It shouldn't be two separate things. I talked about politics, and I talked about business, and I talked about family, and then I talked about Judaism. It's like 4 separate conversations. Judaism has, everything's one. Judaism has something to say about business, it has something to say about family, it has something to say about politics. And if you could, as a matter of fact, Judaism has something to say about sports and about crime. If you could find something with meaning within Judaism, within the conversations that we're having, within the topics, that's when you bring, I think, that's when you really bring godliness into that picture. So we're talking about how to drastically lift our conversations. It's not when we stop the idle chatter and start a new topic, but when we're able to lift the idle chatter and insert godliness into it.
Sorry, I have to leave the meeting. Thank you.
No problem.
Really
Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you, Sam. Okay.
Rabbi, I was just thinking of an example of that very recently. There's, in the community, there's been a lot of discussion, argument about if you know someone who doesn't want to get vaxxed, for example, and they have an anti-vax stance, and the responsibility to, as yourself as a member of that community, to do anything about influencing their decision. And there's the secular view, and then there's the I think we talked about the Judaic, the halachic view about responsibility towards other members of our community. And so I guess that's the example, is where you can have just a secular conversation about the whole vax, anti-vax stuff, and the media is full of it, but then to actually look at what does halakha, what does Jewish law say about the responsibilities towards each other, and when it comes to to things like vaccination. And there's actually a fascinating body of papers and discussions on this, but most people would have never learnt it. And if they give an opportunity to engage, that lifts the conversation. Would that be an example?
I suppose you kind of, and I'm going to say this politely, you kind of took over the conversation to, I suppose, a really important conversation of today. No, I see the connection. 100%. No, I'm just saying. But it is a major contemporary conversation that has to be had. That's all I'm saying. And certainly it's within a conversation. It's interesting because I was just at an outdoor minyan this morning, and there was a doctor there and there was a rabbi there from the Chabad community, and there is one individual in the community that is doing really not well with corona, and the doctor was saying, we really got to encourage people to get vaccinated. This was an individual that was not vaccinated, and now he's in a really, we should really pray for him. I think his name is, they added a name to him today. I'm just checking his name because I'm just quickly say. His name is Gershon Chaim Ben Miriam. So please God, in honor of this shir, you should have a full shlema. but we were just talking about how important. So the conversation was, and he was talking to one of the more senior rabbis or respected rabbis of the community, and he was saying how perhaps the rabbis of the Chabad community at least have sent out a few letters to the Chabad community encouraging people to get vaccinated. And he was saying how he thinks the rabbi should send another one. And I said, look, I think the rabbi should send out a couple of letters. I think it's good, but I think it's more powerful for people when they hear it from doctors. And what actually they did is they did have on those letters from the rabbis, they had the rabbis, the main rabbis of the Chabad community on it, and then underneath there was the Chabad doctors on it. And I said, but I think sometimes when it comes, Dr. Pinchover recently sent a really powerful message, which unfortunately there was one or two words which I think he should have left out because a lot of people gave him a lot of backlash for those particular words. But anyway, I hear what you're saying, how you connect it. Maybe we have to bring the Jewish perspective in, and perhaps that's a lesson. And I think that is an important point. But I do think that it's really important for the when you come to medical things, I think that rabbis should encourage what the Torah perspective is, but ultimately the doctors, the onus is on the doctors to be pushing the agenda as much as possible, unless there is pushback for religious perspectives or whatever it is, or people think that. But I don't think there's anybody that believes that there's any religious reasons why we should be taking the vaccines. At least we're not within the Jewish world. It's not like we're anti-medicine or anything like that.
No, well, where I meant to go with that in context to this specific shiur is that, yes, there may be top-down communication, the letters from rabbis or doctors or whatever, but that communication only reaches its own potential when it becomes part of the conversation between the peers, between the members of the community themselves.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
That's how I'm reading that Mishna, is that it's one thing.
No, and I think it is a conversation that is being had by a lot of the individuals.
In a Torah context.
Yeah, 100%.
That's a good thing.
Yeah. No, it is a good thing. It is a good thing. But I think that you do have a valid point that I think that it should be perhaps more discussed. As you say, a top-down letter is what they've done, saying that we believe that every Jew has an obligation to get vaccinated. Those are the type of letters that have come out. Perhaps if they can have a little bit more of, from a rabbi shouldn't be coming and saying, oh, this thing and it does that, and that they should be saying the Jewish law tells us, and this is the way I would just simply say it, is that Jewish law tells us that we follow the majority of doctors, and the majority of doctors believe that the vaccination getting vaccinated is of extreme importance. And yes, there could be some negative side effects, and there could be some very reputable doctors that argue with it. But at the end of the day, we have to go through the majority. And as far as we know, the majority of doctors are pro the vaccine. And that's I think that's as simple as it is when it comes to the vaccine. Has that particular message being relayed to the broader community? That I don't know. I haven't seen it personally. No. Okay, David, any other points?
No, all good.
Okay. All right. Well, I was going to a second part of the last part of the Mishnah, but I think we'll stop over there for today. And thanks for joining. Thanks for the interaction. And one day we're going to be back in person as well. I don't know how we're going to do it with in person, out of person Zooms. But are people up to being in person, or people just like staying away from individuals at this point? We finally open, and now nobody wants to go near anybody else.
I'm happy to go anywhere. It doesn't make any difference to me. That's life, and that's what I think.
Yeah, I think. Well, that's my personal approach is, and I do understand people that are still worried, especially if they have some underlying issues. But my personal approach is that the best that we can do right now is to get vaccinated, and once you're vaccinated, that's the best. Unless you go to we can't. I fully understand why people would be afraid, but because it is quite it's quite rampant within the community. But I do think that at the end of the day, if you double vax, that's the best protection you can get right now. And I don't think it's healthy for people to stay isolated if they're not worried.
I totally agree. And it's only a short-term problem in the next few months. Better weather, better treatments, the impact of the whole thing's going to reduce, and people shouldn't overplay it.
100%.
Besides anything, that's life. You can't say life's not going to happen anymore. That's life. We're going to live in a society where it's COVID, and just know we're going to live in a life with burning or raining or flood. That's life.
That's
Exactly.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But I very much like the philosophy of just any topic comes up and to ask the question, well, what's the Jewish perspective on this? What's the halachic perspective?
100%.
It's a question that doesn't get asked much, and the answers are usually very, very interesting.
Yeah.
We just had like Cup Day, Hag HaSusim, the festival of the horses. So what's the Jewish perspective on Cup Day? I don't even know. I've just never had a
I don't
shiur
know.
on
There's
it.
only one. There's one famous line that Adas always says, and the other people have adopted. There's a line in the end of chapter 20, Psalm 20 of Tehillim. It says, "Ele v'recha ve'ele v'asusim v'anachnu b'shem Elokeinu nazkir." And usually Cup Day is a public holiday, so usually Cup Day before lockdown started. Both the Kollel and Adas and other communities, they would make a learning day on Cup Day, because it says, Eile v'rechem, these are for chariots, and these are to horses, and we will call out in the name of God. So, come and study. And it's a really good line. So I don't know what the exact idea is. The truth is, there's a lot you could talk about Cup Day with regards to gambling. And that type of topic, and that is an interesting topic in and of itself, and there's been plenty of sharing given on that, but maybe for another time. Okay, thank you so much. Have a great day. Okay, good Shabbos. Bye. Bye.